Over the past month, actually, we've heard people, we've watched people armed with guns, and we've seen people waving their own birth certificates and talking about their constitutional rights out there. A new report by the Southern Poverty Law Center paints a frightening picture of what's going on in the country right now. Wait till you catch this. Almost a decade after largely disappearing from public view, the report says, right-wing militias, ideologically driven tax defiers, and groups called sovereign citizens are appearing in large numbers around the country. A key difference this time is that the federal government, the entity that almost the entire radical right views as its primary enemy, is now headed by a black man. Mark Potok is the man who wrote that. He's a civil rights expert and head of the intelligence project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Mark, put it together. Men carrying guns to presidential rallies, people denying the authenticity, the legitimacy of this president we have, people talking about their sovereign rights as citizens, the governor of Texas talking secession. What's given? What's going on in our country this August 2009?
Well, I think as you're suggesting, Chris, really, that kind of talk, what we're hearing out there may not be specifically coming from militia men, people actually involved in these militias, but it's quite remarkable to listen to the rhetoric out there, the guns, the rhetoric, the talk of death squads and FEMA concentration camps, and all the rest of it. I think what we're really seeing is how this ideology has sprung out of the Patriot movement and kind of in a lot of ways aided and abetted by, in certain cases, mainstream TV commentators, that kind of thing, and some politicians. It has really made its way into the minds of literally tens of thousands, if not more, Americans.
Well, here's my concern. I don't mind. I love free speech. It's what I do. I'm lucky to be able to take advantage of it every night here, and I try to be responsible about it, although I'm provocative like some other people, and we have to keep it in limits. But let me ask you what I'm concerned about, and you're the expert on this. And I'm not going to be too verbal here or too literate because I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea, so I'm going to speak in a bit of code. Back in '63, when we had a terrible situation happen in this country, we never got over it in November of '63, most of us who lived through it. It was a violent act against someone, and a violent act we believe was carried out by someone in the sort of the far left, if you will, the communist sort of oriented world. But the atmosphere in which that occurred was far right and horrible. The hatred of the target of that violence was so much from the right that I worry that a mood is created, a license almost, for violence. And I'm afraid we're getting into it. Your thoughts?
I think it's a legitimate worry. I think the tone out there is really something remarkable. I lived through, as a reporter, the militia movement of the 90s, and, some of the rhetoric out there was quite astounding. But, I think the fact that we're hearing it so much more in the mainstream from people who were, among others, a candidate for vice president of the United States is really quite scary. And, nothing I'm saying is an attempt to suggest that people's speech ought to be limited. I mean, as you said, it's a great thing in this country. But, when you get these people who are relatively mainstream, who have television shows or who are Congress people, and who are saying things that are just absolutely false, made up out of whole cloth, the sad reality is that this gives a feeling of license to people out there.
I agree with you. Let me ask you about...
There are a lot of studies that show that...
What's the connection between carrying guns...
there are a lot of studies that show...
Carrying guns, flaunting them, basically flashing them like this guy, in public, not right to carry. This isn't about constitutional rights. It's about flaunting your right to carry a gun. In public events, this claim that a lot of people on the right are saying the president isn't an American, really. He shouldn't be president, obviously. He's not an American. That's what they're arguing. And this anger about health care. How does it all fit together with the militia movement and the things you're worried about?
Well,
Violence.
in some cases, there's a real through line that we're seeing. This fellow Ernest Hancock, who is the radio talk show host who put up the fellow named Chris in Phoenix, who appeared with an AR-15, strapped to his back at the town hall that President Obama was giving, was very much a militiaman. This guy came out of not only groups that were support groups for militias, but went public in a big way. You know, the same is true for the several people we have seen and heard from talking about watering the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants. You know, I think it's worth remembering that was a central slogan of the militia movement. And at the end of the day, those were the very words, that Thomas and Jefferson paraphrase, that were on the back of Timothy McVeigh's shirt when he blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City.
What role do you think? What role do you think?
To me is twofold.
What role do you think Glenn Beck plays in all this? Open question.
Well, I think he plays a very nasty role. I mean, Glenn Beck will tell you with great indignation that, you know, he didn't float the theory of FEMA concentration camps. He debunked it. But, of course, the reality is that for 3 shows, Beck went out there and speculated about whether FEMA was secretly running concentration camps into which to slam good patriotic Americans. You know, and in the 4th show announced to the world that he had debunked it. I mean, look, to me that is the same as positing for 3 television shows that the earth is flat and then announcing with great aplomb at the end that indeed it is not flat. You know, the reality is there are thousands and thousands of people who listen to a Glenn Beck and who believe that he is an authority figure, and therefore there's probably something to it. FEMA really is out there setting up concentration camps to do in good Americans.
We had Phil Gingrey, he's a congressman from Georgia, on the other night, and I asked him, would you tell, maybe I shouldn't do this, but I said, would you tell your constituents not to bring guns to public meetings involving the president or even congressional meetings because you shouldn't have a gun at the meetings? And he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to tell my people not to bring guns. What's that about? What, that seems like a minimal requirement of going into any meeting. Don't come in armed.
No, I mean, it's a pandering to the far right, if not the radical right. I mean, they're obviously showing a gun or displaying some kind of semi-automatic weapon to a crowd of people with whom you're arguing about health care has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of sane or rational or democratic discussion of health care or any other issue. You know, I think that's the bottom line. I mean, you know, somehow this is being portrayed as people standing up for the Second Amendment and the First Amendment, and to me that's simply absurd. None of this is related to the Second or the First Amendment. You know, what we're really discussing here, or trying to discuss, are real issues that face the country. You know, bailouts of various industries, the healthcare industry, and so on. You know, and this not only doesn't advance us as a country or as a group of people having a debate, it puts us back.
What scares me is that politics is always behind assassinations, to be blunt about it. It's not crazy. There's people like Hinckley that are nuts, but generally it's people like Lee Harvey Oswald, who was he had a fantasy about Castro. He was disillusioned with the Soviet Union, having living here, but he fell in love with Castro, and he thought Kennedy was being too tough to him. You had Sirhan, who didn't like Bobby Kennedy's Middle East policy. He was too pro-Israeli. It's not entirely insane, this behavior. It is horrible. It's tragic. You could certainly say it's evil. But it does have a basis in politics. And I wonder whether people like the birther movement aren't giving people a license, to use your term, to do something awful. Look at the guy who shot the guard at the Holocaust Museum and killed him. He was a birther. He is a birther. He's standing trial. That's his motive.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, yes, the answer is yes. I think there is a kind of license giving in all of this. You know, I mean, what are you really saying? I mean, it seems to me that a lot of these people who are raising the so-called issue of Obama's country of birth really are talking about race. I mean, now I'm not suggesting that every person who questions his birth certificate is the Klansman in disguise, but I think it is hard to get past the idea that at the end of the day, these are people, or a great many of them are people, are looking at a president who is a black man, and they are feeling that this country somehow has been stolen from them, that, you know, his appearance in office shows that the country has been lost in some sense, and there's a huge amount of anger about that, about other very major changes happening in this country. And, you know, yes, I think all of that anger and frustration, especially when it is channeled in this way by politicians
I fear,
and
like
various
you do,
others, is dangerous.
I fear the man with the gun in one hand and the Constitution or the Bible in the other. I do. Mark Potok, thank you very much for this report.